All right. I would love to invite you to open up your Bible to 11. Hebrews 11 and in verse 30. Now, as you're turning on over there, I want to refresh your memories a little bit. It's been a while since I've actually taken it to this chapter. We've been in this chapter for a long time because there's a lot in it. Much of it historical. So we've been going back and taking a look at many of these characters and some of the things that we can learn from Abel to Enoch to Moses and Abraham and all these champions of faith. Hebrews 11, I have heard referred to as the Hall of Faith. I still call it that to this day. And what we've been doing for the last 2 or 3 weeks is we have been doing an examination of Joshua. Chapter 1 a few weeks ago, then we moved into the crossing over of the Jordan. Last week, we were able to examine Joshua chapter 5, which is after they had crossed from the east side of the Jordan over to the west side of the Jordan River. We saw that before they could actually engage in the conquest of the promised land, there were a handful of encounters and things that took place before, one of which was the circumcision of all the male Jews, and we talked about that last week. We observed the Passover feast. We also were able to take a look at the fact that the people in the land, the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the other all kinds of ites, they were shaken in the boots when they found out that God had opened up the Jordan River for the children of Israel to cross over. We're about to move into some of this territory in just a moment now. Consider the beginning of conquest. This is not the more pleasant of some of the things that we have to look into. We always get to know who God is, and we always are able to see the beauty of the Son Jesus and how he shines through it all. We're going to be taking a look at some of these things that transpired, and this will be not the last lesson that we cover in Joshua. I wanted to spend some time in the other stuff to really prepare our minds to in the background on who Joshua was and some of the things that happened in the history. We're going to cover even more history today. And next week, we will take a look at Rahab unless something happens. So let's go ahead and get started with the living Word of God. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30. Let us read. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed for 7 days. So that just tells us what we're going to take a look at today. Now, I'd like to take you back to Joshua chapter 6 to read the actual documentation of this event. Joshua chapter 6. I have the page numbers supplied to you that are in accordance with the Black New King James Bibles in the pews. Joshua chapter 6. I'd like to read the first couple of verses with you. Now, keep in mind the context that They just crossed over the Jordan River. They just finally made it to the promised land, which was huge. Big deal. But it's not done. It's not like they have the land now. They also have to conquer the land. So verses 1 and 2, read with me. Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. And I didn't tell anybody here to shut up. I was trying to read it in a way to not be like, shut up, like shut up as in it was closed off, right? I actually have a memory being in a kid's Bible class, and one of the other kids said, my Bible says to shut up. Like, it really does. Like, look. And he pointed it out, and I was like, it does, Anyway. So, none went in and none went out. Verse 2, Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given into your hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. So I just wanted to introduce the event right there. So Jericho is this city on the west side of the Jordan River. It's the first city that was to be conquered in the promised land that the children of Israel would conquer. And we have a statement here made in verse 2 that the God of heaven has a communication with Joshua and tells him, see, or behold, it's yours. I'm going to give it to you. You're going to go in there, and the king and the mighty men of valor are going to be yours. And he's going to give them some instructions on how to get this done. But before we go any further, I do want to spend a little bit of time just talking about Jericho and what or who Jericho was. And in order to do that, I want us to just consider Jericho from a more historical perspective. I'm going to take you to Genesis chapter 15 and show you a verse back there that gives us a brief idea. Jericho, I didn't look so deep into the history of the city to know exactly who they were. It's probably recorded somewhere along the way, but they are probably Amorites. And the Amorites were a type of people that came from the lineage of somewhere along the lineage in the book of Genesis. And they ended up going to the promised land, and those tribal people just started to grow, and they just became big, big cities, and then they eventually just became all over the place. And so what happened was Abraham was chosen to be God's chosen people, and he was promised the land, the promised land, and everyone in this room, has a pretty decent understanding of what was going on there, right? We all know that Abraham was chosen. He was given a covenant and a promise, and he was promised the land of Canaan. And so I want you to just consider this verse with me, Genesis 15 and verse 16. This is God speaking to him in a dream. And within the context, for some reason, he decides to disclose to him this information that it's not yours yet. It's not going to be yours yet. And he actually gives a really interesting reason as to why. It's something that causes me to just wonder and think. But verse 16, it says, but in the fourth generation, they shall come here again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So what he says to Abraham, and this is within the context of the dream, that your people are going to become a slave in another country somewhere else. So it's going to be nice, probably. I'm sure some of the more wise of the Jews, when they're during the time of slavery, were able to say, guys, remember, God said we'd be slaves for a while. Remember that? Like, I know this stinks, I know this is tough, but God did tell us this was going to happen. He has his purposes. And it'd be hard not to be a little bit bitter if you're one of the children of Israel and be like, okay, so we got to hang out here because the Amorites aren't evil enough yet. Like, I don't quite get that. And to this day, I tell you right now, I'm reading this right now, and I don't quite get that either. And I don't think anybody in this room or any scholar really quite gets that. But God does know. God does get it. So the only thing that I can really conclude from this is God is waiting, and not just because he just wants them to be obliterated. He's patient. There were some good people. Rahab is one of them. We're going to take a look at that next week. So God is a very patient God. I mean, stop and think about it now. I did mention this last week. We have conversations with people. A lot of people see the way the world is going. And I've heard a lot of people say, so what's God waiting for? Why doesn't Jesus just come back now? You know, the world's getting so wicked, it's getting so evil. Guess what? God is a patient God. The wickedness of the world is not yet full. Whatever that means. Whatever that means. He's decided, I'm gonna hang around and wait. Because let's be honest, would anybody here really be disappointed if Jesus came and said, all right, let's go? I'd be like, sweet, let's go. You know what I mean? So it's just one of those things, you know, it causes us to think about stuff like that. So Jericho is one of these Amorites. You know, it's a city of Amorites whose sin during Abraham's time was not quite yet full. Well, guess what? It's full, baby. It's ready. It's ripe with evil. It's ripe with evil. So much so that God takes a people, his chosen people, and says, you're going to go in there and you're going to obliterate them. That's hard for we 21st century Americans to wrap our minds around. We have a hard time with that. I would really just kind of consider it when you think about it. Like, I tell you what, it probably wasn't that difficult for some of our World War II vets to understand. They probably, when they saw what happened to some of those Jews during Auschwitz or whatever it was, when they saw some of the stuff that these Nazis did to Jews, they probably would have said, obliterate them, all of them, man, woman, child. Those people shouldn't continue to reproduce. Now, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure some people would think that way if they saw what they saw. Now, the evil of the Jericho, God decided, I want these people gone. Now I'll take you to Deuteronomy, another text, Deuteronomy chapter 9. We go over to Deuteronomy chapter 9. We have another statement made. This is, now remember, keep in mind Deuteronomy. The word Deuteronomy actually means like the second administering of the law. The word deut, like duet, if you just reverse the U and the E, it's like the word duet, which means two people, you know, playing like a little piece of music together. It's the second administering of the law. It's like Moses' final address to the children of Israel before they get to what we're going into right now, which is the conquest of the land of Canaan. And take a look at it. It's pretty hefty, right? It's what, 30-something chapters? Pretty hefty piece of material here. Moses, this is a long sermon, basically, right? It's a long sermon. Imagine being the children of Israel right now, listen to this whole time. That's a lot of preaching that he told them. He's reminding them about a lot of stuff. Remember the last 40 years? You guys remember all that? Remember the last 400-something years? Remember what he said to Abraham? All of that stuff. So he's reminding them of all kinds of stuff. And I want you to take notice with me. One statement made right here in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 4 and 5. Now keep in mind, he's preparing them to go into the promised land. He says to them, speak not in your heart, after that the Lord has cast them, talking about the Amorites and Canaanites, after he cast them out from before you, saying, it was for my righteousness that the Lord has brought me into the possession of this land. But it's for the wickedness of these nations the Lord drives them out from before you. Not for your righteousness or for the uprightness of your heart do you go to possess the land. But it is for the wickedness. There he just repeats himself. For the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God drives them out from before you. You may perform the word which the Lord swears unto your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's an interesting statement being made right there. Now, It's really interesting to think about. We spend most of our time in the Lord's church doing an examination of the children of Israel, right? And we spend most of our time, we don't do like big hefty studies of who the Amorites were, who the Canaanites were, what kind of stuff was happening, in the land of Canaan at the time. We can read detailed documentation about the way the children of Israel thought, the way they rebelled against God. And it was ugly, right? The 40 years of wandering was ugly. They were horrible. God did all this amazing stuff for them. And what did they do? They fussed and they complained and they had rebellions. They had mutinies. They just kept on going. And we read that and we're like, what was wrong with those people? Didn't they see the 10 plagues? Didn't they see the Red Sea open up? Didn't they see all this stuff? And we look at them and we think these people were nuts. And we can see how just stubborn they were, right? If they were that stubborn, they were that wicked to the point that they were that just ridiculous, how bad do you think the Amorites were? How bad do you think the Canaanites were? Such that Moses tells them here, it's not because you guys are so good, because you ain't. He actually says because you guys are stubborn. It's not because you're so good. It's because they were so bad that you get to go into this land. And of course, we, being able to see the more panoramic view of the Bible, know that this is all about the coming Messiah. We know that. We know that this is about Jesus eventually coming. And so God works it out for them to be there. And then the tribe of Judah becomes the great tribe and all these things. So we know that the rest of history, eventually Jesus comes along from this promised land, or from the promise from God to Abraham. But I wanted us to stop and really think about who Jericho is. And the reason why it's important for us to do that is because you as Christians, you're going to be attacked. And I hope you're having conversations with your neighbors and your friends. You know what? There's skeptics out there. They're going to be like, well, what about Jericho? Why did God do this to the people in the promised land? He was a horrible God. He practiced genocide and all that kind of stuff. You need to be educated and know what was really going on during this time. These people were horrible. And if they weren't kicked out of the land, they would just keep on going down. God took the whole world back in Genesis chapter 6 and wiped them off the face of the planet. Just chose Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. All flesh is but grass to the God of heaven. It's one of those amazing paradoxes of God. He cares about what's going on down here, but he don't at the same time, because he cares more about what's going on in heaven. Because what we do and how we behave and how we act in this life is going to be a reflection of who we are, right? Like, if people die down here, God does care, but what he really cares about is eternal life. That's what he really cares about. It's hard for us to be able to wrap our minds around in certain situations, certain circumstances, but this is one of those times where God made a decision to obliterate a people, and the reason why was because they needed to be cleansed out of there, and he still spared some of the people, and that was by his grace. And we'll take a look at next week, right now. I want us to really think about that. Now, after talking about who Jericho was, the very wicked people, horrible people, and just a couple of details, sacrificing the children to false gods, okay? That's just one example. Those people shouldn't continue to live, okay? Anybody that was cool with that needs to die. That's pretty much as simple as it gets. Yeah, go ahead and argue with that, right? Now I want us to take a look at who Joshua was. Though you know, or may already be familiar, I want you to think about who Joshua was with me. We got this city, Jericho, a wicked city, children of Israel, getting ready to go on in there and conquer the city. You have a man named Joshua who was chosen to lead them. To introduce Joshua, I want to go to the actual introduction of Joshua in the book of Exodus, chapter 17, the first mention of Joshua that we have in the scriptures, at least that I'm aware of. We got these sweet things called concordances in modern day America. Just type in the word Joshua and you can do a search. The first time his name is mentioned, bang, right here, Exodus 17. Exodus 17. Now, many of you will be familiar with what's going on in the history right here. And the book of Exodus, chapter 14, is when God, by the hand of Moses, opens up the Red Sea. So that's just a couple chapters ago. Chapter 15 is the song. They sing a song. They're celebrating. We're free. The Egyptians have been cast into the sea. Chapter 17, we get into some of the struggles now. We're in chapter 15. They start complaining already. Chapter 17, that it's like, we're free. Now what? They're in that zone. They're in that period of time in this particular portion of the book of Exodus. And in Exodus, during this time, they hadn't been cursed to wander for 40 years just yet. However, they're still in a pretty barren land. The land it's not the land that flows with milk and honey. Very deserty. I know of 3 people in this room who have seen the land, and they have reported back to me it was pretty bad. In fact, Laura has a story. She was able to go to the Holy Lands a few years back before she knew me, and apparently one of the buses stopped working, like right in the Sinai country. So the AC wasn't working. Guess what happened? They started fussing. They started complaining for like 2 hours. Imagine being there for 40 years, right? No AC, no nothing like that. So that's a pretty good sign of the fact that it was rough. It was tough times. And not to mention that, right here in Exodus chapter 17, the children of Amalek attack them. So they're kind of lost, you know. Everything that's familiar to them, which is Egypt, is behind them. They aren't sure where they're going to get water, where they're going to get food. Rough time. And on top of all that, people are attacking us. Well, I just want you to read with me a couple of verses, verse 8 and 9. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, that's the introduction of Joshua. Moses said to Joshua, choose out men to go out and fight Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. And this is the famous story when Moses has his hands up in the air, holding up the rod. And I mean, let's be honest, he's 80 years old. His hand's getting tired. His shoulders aren't quite ready for that. He starts getting tired. And as his hands go down, the Amalekites start to conquer. So he's got a couple of buddies, one by the name of Hur, and the other one's name is Aaron, and they start raising his hands up for him. Suddenly, everything starts going good again. Hur, one little piece of history about him, Hur is a him. You guys like that one? Oh, come on now. Give me a little more than that. In my private studies, you should just see how much I laugh to myself. Anyway, actually, truly though, Hur's grandson is the one who made the Ark of the Covenant and built the tabernacle and all that. Like he was given the gift of like using his hands well. He was a carpenter, right? Like Jesus. Anyway. So this is the introduction of Joshua. So the introduction of Joshua, he's a man of war. Man of war. And you remember now, apparently his mind was wired this way. God put it in his heart, put it in his mind to be a man of war. He was Moses' buddy. Whenever Moses went up into Mount Sinai, Joshua went with him. When they were up in Mount Sinai for 40 days and the people started to get impatient and they made the golden calf, they started coming down from the hill and they could hear the sounds of the people celebrating and, worshiping this golden calf. Do you remember what Joshua said to Moses? He says, Moses, it's the sound of war. And Moses says, no, that's not the sound of war. That's the sound of celebrating I hear. But you can just see Joshua heard war. He was a man of war, apparently. That's just what he saw, what he could hear. So he ends up being the man selected to lead his people into the promised land to conquer. Now, he was able to see and witness, and I actually went back and counted as much as I could from this moment when the Amalekites attacked them at the beginning of their exodus, but not at their exodus, but the beginning of their actual freedom, up until Jericho, 11 wars. 11 wars that were fought, most of them one battle wars. They were just won in one battle. And they only lost one. And it was the one when they're in disobedience because of the time when they saw the promised land and thought it was good land, but we can't do it. So they decided, some of the rebels decided to go to war anyway in disobedience to God. And they lost that war. That was the only battle that they lost, the 11. So Joshua was able to be a part of 10 of these wars. The other one that they lost, he did not. He was a part of that. So he saw 11 wars. And we have Jericho, when they actually are in the promised. Now, that's all history and introductory information. Yes, I just finished the introduction to the sermon. Now I'm going to get into what this means to you, what this means to us, what we can learn from. Spoiler alert, Jericho falls. Okay? Just so you know, Jericho falls. Now to get into the lesson, how this applies to us, I'd like to take you to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now, as we consider this text, we have the wise man speaking. I'm going to begin in verse 1, read the first 8 verses of this chapter, and it will become clear as to why I have selected this text to introduce this idea. Many of you have heard the song by the Monkees or whatever band it was, I always forget. Verse 1. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embrace. A time to gain and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. Verse 8, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war, a time of peace. Yes, there is a time for war. There's a time for peace. As I was looking at this with you, I was thinking to myself, now, this is a very interesting topic. I really don't believe, and I just mentioned it a second ago, I'll go ahead and make reference to the Second World War. there's probably very few people who would think that, well, let's just let the Nazis keep doing what they're doing. They're doing okay. It's way across the Atlantic Ocean. Let's just leave them alone. In fact, America tried to do that. If we have our history straight, Japan decides to attack Pearl Harbor. Bam! America's in the war, right? Now, very few people are probably think that's okay, just let them do what they're doing, okay? Now, there's a secular way to think about this. Now, I don't want to talk about war so much in that respect or in that regard as much as I want to talk about it in a secular way. And it's a very interesting concept that I have learned. I'm going to show you a couple of verses that talk about this. But in my secular readings, my secular education, and within my spiritual education, I found an interesting consistency. That is that a time of peace is a very interesting curse upon mankind. Very interesting when you stop and think about it. I'm going to just kind of paraphrase a secular writing that I'm aware of, and it's from Bushido Shushitsu, which is the way of the samurai. Now, the way of the samurai was written a long time ago, like 500 or something years ago, and the history there is that Japan was always in war. There was always civil war. They were just always in war. And as a result of that, they bred one of the most disciplined type of people that the world has almost ever seen. Extremely moral people, extremely disciplined, extremely good at what they do, and even a very spiritual people. And when a man by the name of Ieyasu came along, he united Japan such that civil war wasn't happening anymore. He brought about a time of peace. And you would think that would be a good thing, which I'm sure in a paradoxical way, it is a good thing. However, this is what happened to Japan as a result. Everyone started getting lazy. Everyone started getting to a point where things were just too good. Entertainment started to become a big thing. Drinking and debauchery became the number one thing to do, right? So the book that I am referring to was written simply because they were in a time of peace, and one of the elders said, our people are getting lazy. Things are getting messed up. Morality is going out the window. So let's write something. He was talking to his buddies, let's write something to remind our people of the discipline that they learned during the time of war. I want you to know right now, this is exactly what one of God's main tools has been, to teach people how to be a good people, how to be disciplined. Now, there's a lot of atrocities in war. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not saying in any way that things are justified as a result of war. However, in a paradoxical way, peace isn't all that great. Life being too good isn't all that great. I want to show you a couple of verses now to show you a couple of things here. Proverbs chapter 30, verses 8 and 9. Just a couple of pages back from where we are. Proverbs 30, verses 8 and 9. The book of wisdom. Solomon's writings have been transferred into a man by the name of Agur. You see that in verse 1. And chapter 30, verses 8 and 9, this statement is made. And so the reason why I'm going into it like this, I'm not talking about necessarily war between nations, but I'm talking about the idea of peace and things being too good without there being war to keep us in check. Verses 8 and 9. Remove far from me vanity and lies. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food convenient for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and take the name of my God in vain. Now, the reason why this verse seemed applicable to me is because we have a statement being made here where Agur, the wisdom writer, is making the statement. You know, when things get too good, you start to say, who is God? Who cares? When you get to be too full, you stop looking for God. He says, don't give me riches, because I don't want riches. I don't want life to be too good. But I also don't want to be poor either. We don't want war necessarily, because then we start to get into a place where we start stealing, and we see a lot of bad things happen because of it. So, unfortunately, this is a historical trend in society. The better things get, the worse people get. And then when nations start fighting, people start getting to a point where they say, well, we suddenly magically out of nowhere need God. So a nation will actually start turning more toward God as they suffer. So this is just an overall observation of humanity. I'm going to take a look at another verse with you, Deuteronomy chapter 8. Now keep in mind, as we were already observing earlier, Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy itself is the second address from Moses to his people before they were to enter the land of Canaan. Now, the God of heaven, he knows a thing or two, okay? The God of heaven, he kind of knows some stuff. He's kind of prepared, like he realizes some things that may happen as a result of other things that happen in history. So he, as a result of his incredible foresight, has Moses, his servant, tell this to the people. Now, I'm going to give you just an overall summary of some of the context of the verse that we're going to read. Deuteronomy chapter 8, pretty much in essence is this. Now, when you get into the good land, that's verse 7, when you get into the good land, here's what's going to happen. Life's going to be good. You're going to have everything you need supplied to you. You're going to have 2-car garages. Okay? Every one of you is going to have a cell phone. Every one of you. 50 years ago, no one did. Now, but you know what? When you get into the promised land, you're all going to have a smartphone. And you know what? You know what you can do with this thing? Anything you want. You have people that are willing to give you any flavor of entertainment you could possibly imagine, and it's right at your fingertips, and it's free, by the way. And I'm also going to make sure that you have more square footage per person than the world has ever seen. It's going to be sweet. You're going to have rooms that you do nothing with because you just have so much space. You have so much riches in this promise land you're going to get into. It's going to be so much. You're going to be able to go down the road and say, you know what? I ain't in the mood for sushi right now. I want Mexican. You're going to be able to do that. It's going to be nice. It's going to be sweet. You're going to be living the good life. And you know what? You're going to have enough money to pay this person to bring it to you. He might even wipe your nose for you. It's going to be sweet. Anything you could possibly imagine is yours at your fingertips. When that happens, I want you to stop and think about this. When that happens, this is what you need to do. Verse 17. You say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he that gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swears unto your fathers. And it is this day. But what do you think happened to the children of Israel when they got into the promised land? They said, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this way. What do you think happened to those people? They became very corrupt. Started worshiping idols, doing whatever they wanted to do. Disobeyed God left and right and left, over and over and over, to the point that God sent other nations in and made them go through war. And guess what happened after they went through war? They said, God save us. And guess what God did? He saved them. And then suddenly there were another holy and righteous people again. We're going to be getting into the book of Judges in a little while because, you know why? Because Hebrews 11 tells us about it. Talk about Jephthah, Deborah, Samson. You know what the theme of the book of Judges is? A bunch of spoiled, rotten people having to go through war in order for God to bring them back into a place of discipline and obedience once again, because they kept on going back, disobeying. God would punish them. We'll obey you again. Then they would get the good life again, and then they'd go right back to disobedience again. This is the secular approach. Okay, I'm still just kind of explaining this the overall observation. This is just an observation of human society. And we as Christians and as people who are God-fearing people, we have to look at God for our guidance and not society. Not just go along with the trends of what's going on, because there's always a remnant. Like I keep mentioning Rahab. Rahab was one of those few people who, for some reason, was able to see some good stuff. She may have been a harlot. She was following after the trend of the people that were going along with her at that time for whatever reason. But guess what? She repented. She was able to see who God is. Now, usually, very few people do that. Very few people are able to look past all the goodness that this life has to offer and see that there is something greater in heaven. It's one of the reasons why we have to understand that to God, all flesh is as grass. He will destroy a whole nation just to save a couple of people. He will do that. Our goal is to make sure that we are of that number and that we bring as many possible as we can into that fold. It's not a very popular message. Everyone else has all these goodies. I just described it to everybody. We all have a lot of those things. There might be a few people who are a little bit less on the financial scale, but like I says, if you ain't got a smartphone, it's not hard to get. Not even the great kings of the old days had that kind of entertainment at their fingertips. Incredible what we have. Absolutely insane what we have. What do you think that's going to do to the human mind? What do you think that's going to do to the human heart? And it's going to try to do it to you also. Let's take a look at the spiritual warfare aspect. Take me to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 17. Galatians 5 and verse 17. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Galatia. Some of the context to get you up to where we are in this epistle. Really what's going on, one of the main problems is actually going back to the Jewish law, or going back to the old ways of living. And the Apostle Paul uses this opportunity to help them understand that going back to the law is not going to free you. It's not going to save you. There's only one thing that can save you, and that's the grace of the Son, Jesus. And now what happens as a result of this, they use this as an opportunity to teach them that there is a war going on between the flesh and the spirit. And he goes into some of the details of that. And so I want you to read with me Galatians 5 and verse 17. So let's take a look at it. For the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. These are contrary the one to the other, so that you cannot do the things you desire. Now, main thing I want to extract out of this is the simple fact that there is a war going on. We talked a lot about some of the general observation of society, the secular patterns of war. But also now we must consider, which is the most important to us, of course, because let's be honest, It doesn't matter what's happening in society. We ought not to be influenced by what's going on in society. We need to understand the spiritual side of things, the spiritual war that's going on within us day in and day out. I'll tell you right now, I was thinking about this. So I was like, man, this thing right here, this flesh. I've told a lot of you about that. There was a guy, a good guy back in Alameda, the church that I grew up at. He'd always do this. Man, this flesh right here, to grab his hand and just like pull on his skin. This flesh. I was thinking about that. I was thinking about this war between the spirit and the flesh. It's so tempting to be annoying sometimes, right? It's so tempting to be angry. It's so tempting to be emotional. It's so tempting to give up. It's so tempting to just be lazy. There's so many temptations. It's so tough. And I was thinking, man, I'd be doing really good if it wasn't for this flesh. And I say right there, that is it right there. If it wasn't for this flesh, man, I'd be just worshiping God all day long, praising Him. It's the flesh that keeps me from doing it. But I tell you right now, if I didn't have to go to bed tonight because of this, I'd probably just be praying all night. I've tried it. Anybody ever tried it? In the book of Luke, when it says that Jesus went to a mountain and prayed all night. I mean, I was in college at the time. I was reading that. I was thinking, man, that's where it's at right there. I want to be like Jesus. So I said, tonight, I'm going to pray all night, baby. I'm not going to bed tonight. I'm praying all night. And I woke up at like 7 a.m. I was like, what happened? Like I tried so hard to pray all night. You know how much discipline it takes? But if it wasn't for this thing, it would have been nice. It would have been easy. But I get sick all the time, if I didn't have to eat. It's nice just to read the word and not have the flesh like getting in the way all the time. But it's the flesh that gets in the way. And guess what? There's a war going on. And that flesh keeps trying. Now, we're not just talking about like the big obvious sins. We're not talking, like I'll preach to the murderers out there, the people in prison on death row. This is about you and putting God first in everything in your life. The flesh doesn't want you to. The flesh gets in the way. There's a battle going on all the time. And that's the spiritual war that's happening all day, every day. There's a verse in the 121st Psalm that says that He that keeps us, the God of heaven, will not sleep and will not slumber. And it's such a blessing. But you know what? The devil don't sleep either, apparently. Because he's always working on you. He's working through the billboards and the apps on your phone and all this stuff. He's always planting seeds. You resist him, he flees from you, but he'll be back, man. He keeps on coming back for some reason because of this. If it wasn't for this thing, it would be okay. But guess what? You're stuck with this for now. Well, who's going to win that fight? Who's going to win that battle? It's a spiritual warfare. You got to make sure you give God His glory and give Him your obedience, because the book of Romans tells us in Romans chapter 6, whoever you obey is whose servant you are. So don't obey the deeds of flesh. Okay, he's talking to Christians there. Just finished saying when you were baptized, you were buried into Christ. Therefore, you're dead to sin, so don't live in it anymore. So spiritual warfare is a real thing. I want to give you a couple of tips on this war that you're going through. You can't just get rid of this. You're always going to have enemies. King David, he always had enemies. He never caught a break. Well, guess what? You got an enemy, and you're living in it right now. It's such a hard thing to deal with. It's tough being human. It just is. I want to take it to Proverbs chapter 24. Just a little something here. A little something. Did I hit the clicker yet? Yeah. Proverbs 24, verse 6. Now, another extremely rich context. The whole chapter is kind of its own theme. In a lot of the Proverbs, you have like these one sentence gems, just these little sayings. 24, to me, according to my study, from the first to the last verse, I think the dude who divided the chapters up did a good job. I think that it all has a nice smooth stream of a theme. And so chapter 24, verse 6, well, what he's talking about is pretty much kind of like the struggle of being human, building the right things, working on the right things. The end of the chapter, he talks about the house of the sluggard, the property of the sluggard. You go to the house of the sluggard, the wall is cracking. There's weeds growing all over the wall. You got like ivy and thistles and all this stuff growing all over it because he's not taking care of his stuff. And so the whole theme of the chapter is take care of your stuff and you won't have that problem. Well, don't forget that Solomon is also instructing his son, and his son's going to be a king one day, right? So he's telling his son, hey, if you don't take my advice, take my wisdom, it's going to be rough because you're going to have enemies. There's going to be war. And so the same stuff applies to us when it comes to spiritual war. So let's take a look at it. Verse 6, Proverbs 24 and verse 6. It just simply says, for by wise counsel you shall make your war, and in a multitude of counselors there is safety. One cool thing about what we're about to get into, as we move through the book of Hebrews, there's a neat statement that's made. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. Because remember, Hebrews 11 is the Hall of Faith, talks about Abel and Enoch and Abraham and Sarah, and, Isaac and Jacob and all these characters. Well, Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1 introduces that chapter by saying, therefore, since we are compassed about or surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses. Cloud of witnesses. That's like a neat poetic way of saying we have lots of examples. We have lots of teachings. We have lots of characters that we can look to for our lessons and learn from. Jesus is everything and all we need, but it's kind of nice to read about people who struggled a lot and still conquered and made it through life. And that's what we get out of these people that we read about, because life gets tough. I've heard people say this kind of thing. I've said this kind of thing. Man, I ain't Jesus. I can't get through this. He was perfect. I ain't perfect, okay? Yeah, but we have a lot of imperfect people who still put their faith in God. There's no excuse. There's lots of lessons. Right now, we're all worshiping together. We're all worshiping together. There's a cloud of witnesses right here. There's a multitude of counselors right here. You want to talk about a couple Bible verses? Give me a call, man. I love it. You want to talk about a couple of verses? Give a couple of brothers and sisters a call. We'll talk about it with you. You're going through something. You have prayers that will be elevated up into the heavens for you, because there is safety in the multitude of counselors. You're going through a war. Don't fight it alone. Fight it with your brothers and your sisters and Abraham. Fight it with Abraham. Fight it with the Apostle Paul. Fight it with Jesus. Fight it with all these people. We're going to get into that kind of stuff in chapter 12. But there's no excuse to lose the war. There's plenty of teachings and scriptures and people around you that want to see you succeed. Most of all, Jesus himself. He didn't hang on that cross to let you fail. He hung on that cross to make you succeed. So make your war wise counsel. I'm reminded of a Bible class we had just a couple Sunday mornings ago. Brother Anthony says, so how do we not sin? A couple of answers. So pretty much the answer is this. The way to not sin is to plan not to. That's quite a strategy. That's what it takes to win a war. Strategy. You wake up in the morning, you give your life to God. When you wake up in the morning, you ask the Son to strengthen your heart, and you ask the Holy Spirit to guide you, and you read the text. Make sure that you are living and breathing the words. What did he say to Joshua? We talked about this 3 Sundays ago. Joshua chapter 1, the words that I give you, they shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall observe to do all of them, and by this you will find good success. By this. Psalm 1, blessed is a man that walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. That's strategy. Don't hang out with the sinners. That's strategy. Don't take advice from a bunch of people that are evil. Take advice from God. Take advice from Jesus. Take advice from your brother. Not them. Take a look at another one, Psalm 18. Now, right about now in the lesson, you might be thinking, to yourself, whatever happened to Joshua? Don't worry, we're going back to Joshua. Just a little bit. I got you captive here for a minute here. I tell you what, Paul preached till midnight, so I might fall short of that. Just like I couldn't make it through the prayer all night, I'm not going to make it till midnight today. But I might go a few minutes after, though, afternoon. I'll show you a couple of things. Psalm 18, verse 29. Another rich context by King David here. He wrote this psalm after great victory. So it's like a victory psalm. And he makes these statements after he has victory, which is victory in war, by the way. He says in verse 29, for by thee, talking to the God of heaven, I have run through a troop. By my God have I leaped over a wall. So there's your advice right there. It's by the God of heaven you do it. Verse 34, he teaches my hands to war, so that a bow of steel is broken in mine arm. Let God teach you. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 11. Learn of me. Learn from him. Verse 35, you have also given me the shield of salvation, and your right hand has held me up. Your gentleness has made me great. So that is how we win the war. And then one more text. I'm going to take you to the New Testament, 2 Timothy chapter 2. Show you what the Apostle Paul said to Timothy. Now, according to my studies of the second epistle of Timothy, the feel that I get is that Timothy is discouraged. Because, you know why? You know why he's discouraged? Because of this. You know what I'm saying? He's discouraged because of this, because he's human, because it's tough to be human sometimes. And he's a servant of God. He's a preacher of the word. And it wasn't always working out that well for him in the first epistle. Paul tells him, don't let people stop on you because you're younger than they are. Don't worry about that. You just keep on doing what you know you ought to do and all that kind of stuff. Well, he writes to him again in a second. And he uses this kind of language to help boost him back up. He says in verse 1, you therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things that you have heard among me, of me among many witnesses, the same commit to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. You therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. So he's describing him now, in verse 3, as a soldier, because Timothy is a soldier in battle. We just talked about that. It's a battle between God and the flesh, God and the world. Verse 4, no man that fights in the war entangles himself with the affairs of this life. I'm telling you, that's a big deal, that one right there. That one's a big deal. Because this particular form of strategy in war is something that in secular war has been used. You can take a look at it. The great Sun Tzu, who wrote the book, The Art of War, one of the strategies he gave his people, or he wrote in the book was, if you can get your people, if you can get your warriors to forget about life, you can get them to do anything for you. They will fight to the death for you because they see the cause of victory as the one and only purpose in life. And great generals are able to do that. What about we Christians? Are we able to take a look at our life and say, my whole purpose is to forget about this life, forget about this? Because no good soldier cares about what's going on down here. We care about what's going on in heaven. When we start caring about what's going on down here, that's when we start compromising our victory. So he makes this statement. He actually says, no man that fights in the war. He didn't say just the best ones. He didn't say just the preacher or just the leaders. He didn't say nothing like that. He said none of you. None of the soldiers care about what's going on down here. You know what? I care too much about what's going on down here sometimes. It messes with me because of this. The Apostle Paul made the statement in Acts chapter 20. He made the statement, he says, none of these things move me because I don't count my life dear to myself. You got to get to a place where you just stop caring. That's when your life's going to get good. When you don't care no more. Care about God's purposes. You entangle yourself with what's going on down here. It messes things up. That's the strategy. So there was a comparison to be made, Now, as we take a look at the children of Israel, now I'm taking you back to the children of Israel again. There's a comparison I want to make. Now, this is the Numbers 14. I think, we're good. Numbers 14. Now, this is when the children of Israel, they sent the 12 spies into the promised land, and they came back, and they gave a report. Hey, the land is great, but the children of Anak, they're like giants. Ain't no way. Ain't no way we can beat them. They disobeyed God. The book of Joshua, it actually says that they fell in the wilderness. Their carcasses fell in the wilderness because they disobeyed God. That's why. And it's an interesting comparison that I want you to think about with me now. Okay. Joshua chapter 6. I'm going to take you to Joshua chapter 6 now. And we're going to read a little bit more about what actually happened in Jericho. I want you to read with me a few verses. Joshua 6. So we already read the first two verses together. So what I want to do is read verses 3 through 5. It says, and you shall compass the city, or march around the city. All the men of war, and go around about the city once, you shall do for 6 days. And 7 priests shall carry the ark in the front of the priests with the 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day you shall compass the city 7 times. And the priests shall blow with the trumpets. Verse 5 says, and it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horns, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout. The wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up every man straight before him. So, there's 2 generations I want to talk about now. Every generation has its remnant that more obedient. That's obedient and does what God says. But of these two generations, we have the generation that crossed over the Red Sea, and we have the generation that crossed over the Jordan River. Two generations. And one of those generations made it into the promised land, the other did. They were able to get out, out of Egypt, but they didn't make it into the promised land. And I'd already mentioned that the reason why is because of disobedience. Now, I just want to bring you one comparison. I'm going to summarize it for you because I know many of you already know the history. And if I were to get into the verses and the details of it, the sermon would be even longer. But the children of Israel in captivity, just a real interesting comparison. I want you to think about it. I want you just to meditate upon this with me. Think about it throughout the week. And I'm not even drawing any actual conclusions out of it. I'm just making an observation out of it. I want you to think about it with me. The children of Israel that left the promised land, or that left Egypt, rather. Here's the observation that I kind of made, okay? God pretty much did everything. He just opened up the Red Sea and just walked over, and then they're in the promised land, or then they're in the wilderness. And then when they were going to go to the promised land, the knees got weak. That generation fell in the wilderness. The interesting observation that I made is this. God gave the children of Israel who crossed over the Jordan River a really bizarre instruction. Stop and think about it. You're going to march around the city once today. Okay? Got it? Got it. Why are we doing this? I don't know. Okay. Do it for 6 days. Okay. They did it for 6 days. Then God says, 7th day. They do it 7 times. My feet are getting tired, God. I don't care. You do it. They marched around the city 7 times. What did the children of Israel do? They did it. Then what happens? Walls fall down flat. And it was because they obeyed. Because they obeyed. There's a lot of stuff that we do not get, we do not understand. God says, I don't care what you think you know. You just do what I say. That's just interesting. Because here's the whole thing. God demands our faith and obedience. Even if it's a bizarre task that we just don't get. Yeah, a bunch of people getting dunked in water, not sure what it means. Yeah, we'll do it. Why'd you pick water? God said do it, so do it. That's it. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that they were wondering, why we're doing this? But there's something about the children of Israel of this generation, they were more obedient. And that was the difference. God gave them some random task, they did. I just thought that was interesting. So it makes me think about it now for us. We're living in a crazy world. Living in a world where things are just so many shiny objects, aren't there? So many shiny objects in the world. I just want to say and bring to your attention just this idea. Go with me to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Now, the First Thessalonian epistle, he's doing a lot of reminding. It's almost like an epistle where he's just reminding them of some stuff. And he actually uses this as a comforting thing, what we're about to read, chapter 4. He says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. I want you to read it with me, if you would. The Apostle Paul writes, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trump of God, the dead in Christ shall rise first. And when we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so shall we ever be with the Lord." Now that's the comforting, the more comforting way that he brings it to our attention. Some of the things that made me think about this text, just some of the symbolisms that we find in Joshua. There's the sound of the trumpets and then a shout. And the sound of the trumpets and the shout where usually the sound of a trumpet is a sound of war, but it's not always a sound of war. Sometimes it's a sound of celebration, and a shout followed. One of the verses of the Bible that I read showed, actually interpreted the shout of the children of Israel being a shout of joy. And even though this is a very morbid thing in some ways, like the going into Jericho was a very morbid thing. A lot of people died, right? But you stop and you think about it now, symbolically. Now I can't get into all the symbols because there's tons of symbols in the story of the fall of the walls of Jericho, the fall of Jericho. But a couple that I wanted to share with you right here, right now, is that the sound of the trumpet to us honestly ought to be a good thing. Now Jesus came down, and we kind of have walls around us, and Jericho was a very wicked city, right? The truth is, we're all very wicked also. We're all very wicked. And when Jesus comes in, kind of like when he cleansed the temple, when he went into the temple, he tore things up. He was turning over tables, and he got a whip, and he just started driving stuff out of there. When he came to the temple, he cleansed it out. That is in a certain sense what he does for us. When he gets into our heart, he has to do some stuff in there and obliterate some things, right? But here we have on the last moment, the last day, there's going to be a trumpet that's going to sound, and there's going to be a shout, and if we're still alive, we get caught up in the clouds. Those who have passed on before us are going to be resurrected, and it's going to be a beautiful thing. But it's not going to be a great day for everybody. A lot of people are going to die. A lot of people are not going to love the appearing of Jesus. This is very, very important for us to keep in mind. Now, this is a massive reality for us. Huge reality, okay? It's hard for us to keep these things in mind because there's so many shiny objects. It's hard for us to really focus because of this flesh. We keep getting distracted. But I want to take you to another verse, 2 Thessalonians. Just a page over from where we just were. Apparently, the Thessalonians needed these kinds of reminders because it's very similar. But this one's more on the dark side. It's more on the side of judgment and justice rather than the celebratory call and shout of the trumpet. Now, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. Now, the Apostle Paul is comforting the Thessalonian Christians, but he's also making a statement about the disobedient here as well. So verses 6 through 9, read with me. Seeing it is a righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to them that trouble you. And to you who are troubled, rest with us when the Lord Jesus. Okay, now stop. What we're about to read is a representation of fact. Okay? When the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angel, in flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not God, and that obey not the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. I was reading this and I was thinking to myself, man, you know, when I was a kid, I remember certain times I had 3 older brothers and we'd be acting kind of crazy. In fact, we had tons of wrestling matches in the living room. I mean, just hundreds and thousands of them. All against my mom's wishes, all against my father's wishes. We broke many windows, and my mom just loved the Victorian stuff. She just loved it. I broke many women, like porcelain women in big dresses. I broke many of those little trinkets just because there was 4 boys in the house. I'll tell you what, we would be acting a certain way as soon as my dad walked in the room. What do you think happened? We were angels. We were like angelic beings. There was a halo all round about my head. I just behaved in a totally different way when the reality of my father came into the room. And it was like nothing ever happened, you know, except for the broken porcelain thing on the ground, you know. But we got away with it quite a bit. I was just thinking about it like this, man. How much would we really brush off out of the Word of God if Jesus and the power of his mighty angels was right there? Let's stop and think about that for a second. How many of us would go to the 1 Corinthian epistle in chapter 14? How many people, I'm not talking about just here, I'm talking about all over the place. How many people would get to 1 Corinthians chapter 14 when it talks about edifying, when it talks about some of the rules and regulations that ought to be observed when we worship together, things being done decent and in order, when it talks about how we ought to be when we're together. How many people would read that and be like, yeah, but we don't have to worry about that kind of stuff? If Jesus, in the power of his mighty angels, was right there, how many of you would still be watching that scene on TV that's on, if the power of Jesus and his mighty angels just came on through the living room, how many would be like, oh, hey, come on in, Jesus, have a seat while we watch fornication right before us? How many of you would actually do that? Now, I'm just asking you, remember, no good soldier entangles himself with the things down here. Now, he's going to be fighting a war one day, and he's going to win that war. When he comes to the power of his mighty angels, one angel way back in the book of Isaiah showed up and obliterated the world's greatest army overnight. That's the angels he's going to have with him when he comes down here. How many of us are just going to be like, relaxed when that happens? You're going to be trying to figure out what you can do better, don't you think? Now, the whole purpose for me bringing this up to you right now is to help you understand and realize that the God that you serve, Jesus, he is not just the God of peace. He is also the Lord of hosts. Do you know what the Lord of hosts means? That title was introduced in 1 Samuel. It was introduced in 1 Samuel. The Lord of hosts means he's the Lord of the armies. He is not just the God of peace, he's also the God of war. You got to stop and really take a look at your life, because you serve the God of war and the God of peace at the same time. Do you know who Jesus is? He's Joshua. He's Joshua. Did you know that? Do you know that Jesus is Joshua? I'm not saying that Joshua was an eternal being. I'm saying that every good thing in the Old Testament, Jesus fulfilled. Jesus is the high priest Aaron. You know who Jesus is? He's the high priest Aaron. Jesus is the deliverer of the law, the perfect law of liberty, the law of Christ. Jesus is Moses. You know who Jesus is? Jesus is Melchizedek, the king of peace and the king of righteousness from the book of Genesis. Jesus is the king. Jesus is King David. Jesus has a special connection with Joshua. You know what that connection is? He has the same name. Yeshua. Joshua's name was Yeshua, which is where the name Jesus came from. Yeshua means Yahweh saves. Jehovah saves. But you know what, Joshua? You know what he did in order to give the people the land? He did a lot of conquering too. And when Jesus comes, a lot of people are going to die. Jesus comes, a lot of people are going to wish they knew Yeshua. I'll bring you back now just to the one last verse. We'll paraphrase it. Turn over there if you want. Joshua 13, 5:13. Remember Joshua, before he goes into Jericho, he sees a man, a sword in his hand. He approaches this man and he says, "Are you for us or against us?" You know what this man said? Neither. Neither. But I'm for the armies of the Lord. So if we were to ask him the same question right now, you know what he'd say? Neither. But I am Yeshua. If you don't obey me, you're going to die. Make sure that ain't you. While we sing together.